Yeah, so I guess this is the second part, so to speak, of our interview. Maybe as a brief recap for people and for both of us. Last time I thought had a pretty cool episode. You got introduced to psychology by Donald Hebb. You then did a postdoc in Prague and fled after the Russian invasion to London. John O'Keefe showed you some of the first place cell recordings. You offended the editor of Psychological Review, and then you wrote the book, The Hippocampus as a Cognitive Map, as a very brief run-through. And I thought we could kind of pick up where we kind of left that episode, maybe still with the Hippocampus as a Cognitive Map book. Maybe a first question I had, which, so I looked in the beginning of the book, you have as in many books, the dedication. And in your case, it reads, to E.C. Tolman, who first dreamed of cognitive maps in rats and men, D.O. Hebb, who taught us to look for those maps in the brain, and A. Black, who insisted that we pursue our route with rigor. So the first two names, I think most people recognize. I'm not so familiar with the third person. I'm just curious, who was the third person who was influential in that book?
So Abe Black was a psychologist who was at McMaster University, who was already famous in the late 60s, early 70s for work on avoidance behavior and related things. And because he was at McMaster in this period, he was in contact with Case van der Wolf, who was at that point one of the leading figures in recording theta activity from the hippocampus. So Abe became interested in the hippocampus, and for reasons I still don't fully understand, he decided to come and do a sabbatical year. I think it was a year, it may have been 8 months, in London with me and John in 1974. So he came, and we became very friendly and very engaged, and he really jumped head first into the project, so to speak. And we wrote a few papers together about avoidance behavior and the role of the hippocampus in avoidance behavior. He taught us a lot about that stuff, and we taught him about the hippocampus. And, we became extremely good friends, and he was a very invaluable sort of part of the emergence of the book, you might say. But then he got sick and died of pancreatic cancer before the book came out in 1978. So, that was quite shocking for me and John, basically. So he was just somebody who was influential at the period when we were creating the book. He was very important for our thinking about avoidance behavior and any related learning and conditioning stuff. That was his background. And just an all-around great guy that we just got along with very well, both socially and scientifically. So, it was still raw in our minds, that Abe had passed away. He was like 50, maybe 49 or something when he died. It was really kind of tragically early and so on. So that's who Abe Black was. He's somebody that people should know about. I mean, if you go to Wikipedia, you may or may not find him, but if you go to Google Scholar, he edited some books, he published important articles on avoidance behavior, but it all ended in 1978 because he died. So he's not somebody that people know about now, but he was pretty important back then, and he was very important to us.
Okay. I'm curious, so you published the book, you finished it. What happened? What was the kind of response to it? Did no one notice? Did people not like it? Did they like it?
Well, John and I kind of speculated, that we'll publish this book and it'll either sink like a stone, that nobody will notice it, or it'll stir up, vast and sometimes not so positive reactions. I would say what happened was sort of in the middle. It was noticed very quickly. It was picked up very quickly. There was a book review in Science fairly soon after it, so it was noticeable in that sense. Book review was written by Gary Lynch, who is another famous big figure in the early days of Hippocampus, who's actually still active at UC Irvine. But Gary Lynch did some of the earliest work on LTP and the calcium story with LTP. He wrote a book review that was pretty positive. And then it got selected as a target article for Brain and Behavioral Sciences, so that we wrote a sort of a kind of a concise version of the book for as a target article for BBS. came out in 1979 with lots of comments from lots of people, and our response to those comments, which, went all the way from, brilliant and exciting to these people are completely wrong and nonsense. So but it was noticed. There's no question it was noticed, and people picked up on it, and there was a lot of excitement. I would say in the initial days, it made an impact, and it certainly sort of smoothed my path to getting jobs and things like that. So it was noticed, but then it died down a little bit. The field continued to grow, and basically the book is now a historical artifact, in some ways. Although here in Trondheim, the students chose it as a book to read for historical interest. So they have a little book club, and they're reading the book, so to speak. And I sat in on one of their sessions. It was quite fun. So I would say the reaction to the book overall was quite positive. In many ways, it was negative in some other ways, but those were more about the science. But sort of as an impact, and both on on my career, on John's career, and so on, and on the field. It had a pretty positive response, I would say.
Okay. Yeah, just as a brief comment here for people who are interested in reading the book, I couldn't really find it to buy anymore on Amazon, but you can download it for free on the UCL website, which I'll post in the description.
Yeah. Also on the University of Arizona website, it's also available there at the library and the archives. So anyone can download it. That's trivial. When it first came out, they printed about 2,500 copies, I think, something like that. And then some years later, they pulped, 600 or 700 of them, because it sold less than 2,000 copies. We didn't make much money from that book. They pulped it, and they gave us, we'll send you 10 copies each or something, before we destroyed the rest. And so we got a bunch of copies for free, and we handed them out to our family and friends and stuff like that. And that was it. And they destroyed the plates. The plates no longer existed. These were pre-computer days. There's no digital version of it. So that when it came time to think about republishing it, they said, we don't have the plates anymore. Somebody would have to key the whole thing in again. We're not going to do that. So they released the copyright to us, and that's how we could post it for free. They released the copyright. So, but it's really hard to find. I think if you go on eBay, you can still find a copy sometimes. People who had it die and their kids sell it because they have no idea what, so it's, you can still find a copy if you look hard in some of the, antiquariate, bookseller kind of stuff. I have 3 or 4 copies. That's it. But it's, if you do find a copy online, it's not going to be cheap. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, now it's a classic book, and there's, as you said, not many copies.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so to kind of continue through your career, I mean, we only kind of did the beginning in the last episode, until you basically, if I remember correctly, you'd already left UCL at this point, before the book was published. So yeah, maybe where did you go after that, and why?
Well, I left UCL for personal reasons, because I had kids and had split up with their mother, and she took the kids back to the States. And so I decided I needed to be back in the States, to be available for my kids. So I left UCL in a kind of a lecture or tenure track kind of position, with no job, just to go back to the States. The book wasn't finished yet. This was 1976. So I was still working on some of the chapters, and, I figured I could just go somewhere and hang out. And I had saved up some money from a sabbatical I had done in Norway that paid me very well. And I figured I'd just go and hang out in the States for a while and see what happens, which I did. And that didn't last very long because I ran out of money. And I called a good friend of mine in San Diego, Larry Squire, a name I'm sure you know. Yeah. Because we had been good friends for, ever since graduate school. And he said, come on out to San Diego, and I'll pay you for a year as a researcher here, and we can do some work on amnesia. And I hadn't worked with humans before. So I said, great, I'll do it. So I went to spend a year with Larry, in La Jolla. And I tested the patient NA, who was Larry's, best patient in those days. Did a lot of things about language and memory, which was me moving in a slightly different direction. And it was a good year, but then it was over. And then, luckily for me, I got a call out of the blue from somebody at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia who said, "We're inviting you to come in for a 2-year contract to replace Graham Goddard, who got a kind of a research fellowship that bought out his teaching. And they needed somebody to do his teaching and so on. So would I be interested in doing this? I still don't know why they asked me, but Graham Goddard was also a graduate student at McGill at the same time that John O'Keefe and I were graduates. So I knew him, and he might have been the one who recommended me. I don't know. And Graham Goddard is himself, a legend in the field. I mean, he did very early, absolutely critical work on the amygdala. When he left McGill about a year before John and I did, he went I think to Waterloo and sort of made that place into a haven for good research. And then he went to Dalhousie where he did the same. And then he went to New Zealand to the University of Otago in Dunedin, and he did the same thing there. He was a serial builder of great departments, basically. But then he met an untimely death, again, very young, in a hiking accident in the mountains around New Zealand. It was just a crazy story. Anyway, I went to Dalhousie for 2 years, replacing Graham Goddard. And when I arrived there, it became clear that nobody knew I was coming. They hadn't really informed anybody in the psychology department that, so-and-so was coming to replace Graham. So it was kind of interesting at the beginning, but it turned out to be a spectacular place for me to be. First of all, I finished the book there. That was, helpful. But also, the place had both really good sort of physiological psychology, you might say. The combination of brain and behavior stuff is a Canadian department again, so it had that mixture. And it also had some really strong cognitive psychologists. So I really learned a lot of cognitive psychology at Dalhousie. That's kind of where I converted over to more of a cognitive psychologist than a rat running, animal behavior person. So Dalhousie was really, a great place to spend a few years. I met Bruce McNaughton and Carol Barnes there. They were, Carol was a postdoc and Bruce was a graduate student finishing up his PhD with Graham Goddard. I met Rob Sutherland, who also became very, famous for his hippocampal research. Sutherland and Rudy, people in the field know this name. He's still active. He's at Lethbridge. I met several other people who I subsequently collaborated with. I just met a lot of people there who were really important for my subsequent career. And it was a wonderful department. I had 2 great years there. But it was not a great environment because by that point, my kids had, shifted from living with their mother to living with me. And they were teenagers, just beginning to be teenagers. And Halifax was not a great place for them to be. It was kind of a depressed maritime city. And either they went to public schools, with kids whose aspirations were quite limited in terms of what their life goals were, or you paid a lot of money to send them to private school, which was never an option for me, not because of the money, because I just didn't believe in private schools for the kids. So I decided to leave, basically, even though over the course of the 2 years, they kind of got used to me being around, and they would have given me a position if I wanted to stay, but I didn't. So I left, again without a job, and went back to California and just hung out for a year, living on Canadian unemployment money, basically, and thinking and writing. And then I got a call out of the blue from Gary Lynch, the guy who wrote the review of the book. And he said, I was in San Diego. I went back to where I had roughly been when I was working in Larry's lab. And he said, you want to teach a course? I'm buying out of a course. Do you want to teach a course on sort of the neurobiology of cognition or something like that? So I said, sure, sounds like fun. So I, did that. I would drive up to Irvine from North County, San Diego, several times a week, and I would teach. And I would hang out there for a while. I had and still have, a sibling, my brother, who's now dead, but his wife, they were living in Newport Beach, right, 10 minutes from UC Irvine. I stayed at their house overnight, sometimes. So I got kind of caught up in the UCI community, even though I had no job. And as a function of that, I got involved with the people in cognitive science there. They had a strong cognitive science program, and I met those people, and they decided it would be a good idea to get me a postdoctoral fellowship, which they had money to provide. They had a big Sloan Center grant. Sloan at that point, the Sloan, I don't know if they're still doing it. They were funding cognitive science. They were trying to kind of nucleate cognitive science as a field. This was in 1980. Right. So I got hired on and I got paid, and then I convinced the people there to sign off on a grant application so I could set up a lab, and I got funded by NIH to set up a lab. I still didn't have a job. This was soft money. I was like an adjunct person, but they facilitated me, getting a grant, and that paid me for 3 years and provided the money for a lot of the research I did in the 80s on developmental stuff. And then that ran out. But pretty much as that ran out, I got through the connections with the people in cognitive science. I got introduced to people from University of Arizona, one of whom was doing a sabbatical in the cognitive science group, a philosopher named Mike Harnish. And he said, we're about to start up a cognitive science program in Arizona. Maybe you would be interested in being a part of it. So I went down there and gave a talk at a symposium. The chapter is published in a book in 1984 or something like that. The Neurobiology of Mental Representations was the chapter. So I was thinking about, how does the brain represent stuff, basically, which is a good cognitive question, but also a good brain question. Anyway, they recruited me to Arizona to be sort of the first person hired in this new cognitive science program, but somebody who would bridge between brain and behavior, brain and cognition. I was meant to be the glue person. So then we also hired a bunch of other people, and that's how I ended up at Arizona, basically. And they gave me my first job. My first real job in the States, which was as a full professor with tenure. I never went through the tenure process. I was hired, off of soft money straight into tenure, which was pretty unusual. I guess I was really lucky. I never had the angst of going through tenure or anything like that. So just at the point when they had a lot of money and a lot of opportunity to build the cognitive science program, to rebuild the psychology program, which was not very good at that point. And then we started hiring, incredible people. We had resources. And then within about a year or two, or 3, maybe 4, I can't be sure, it became clear that the department head was not somebody who was really going to realize the best for the department in psychology, which was where my appointment was. It was part psychology, part cognitive science, but my tenure home was in psychology. So I became the department head in psychology, which was totally unanticipated by everybody who ever knew anything about me. That I should be a department head was a completely ludicrous idea. But I turned out to be pretty good at it. We hired, and I was, spearheaded the hiring of lots of really great people, including Bruce McNaughton and Carol Barnes, and, getting the funding to build them a state-of-the-art laboratory. I mean, multi-million-dollar deals. And the department grew, and it was just we hired a lot of good people. Dan Schachter, John Kilstrom, Merrill Garrett. These are all, famous names in cognitive psychology at the time, memory and language and perception and so on. We had a good thing going, and I was, pretty instrumental in a lot of that, I would say, with a lot of help, of course, from others. And that continued on through the 90s, basically. So this is sort of, I'll get back to what I was doing from a research point of view, and then the state shut the spigot off, basically, and stopped funding this thing at the level they were funding it. And so things, there was a golden era of about 8 to 10 years when we were building and growing and and recruiting great people and so on. And then it became less, that became less the case. So I was department head for 13 years, and then I stopped being department head, but stayed on, doing my research. So, that was the progression, and there were other things I did later on, at the university. I became very involved in university administration things, working in the provost's office a little bit, getting involved with faculty governance, became chair of the faculty of the whole university. I got very involved in some of that stuff. But that's not the science part of the story. That's the sort of, structural part of the story.
Yeah, I wanted to, kind of before we get maybe more into your time in Arizona, kind of what you did there, I'm just curious because it sounded like you had. I'm curious, like whether you had, well, in a sense, much of a career plan until you were in Arizona, because the way you tell it, it sounds like it's kind of like, well, I went there and then I didn't know what to do, so I just did this, and I don't know, that someone gave me money and.
The one thing you could not ever do is say I had a kind of a plan in my mind about what was, how this was going to unfold. Never. That was never the case. I mean, I have to say, I never really thought about this is the way the next 10 years are going to play out, and these are my goals, and that's just not the way I've lived my life. Possibly to my detriment, but that's not the person that I am. So. I mean, I just went with it, when opportunities arose, I grabbed them, and there was a general plan, which was to be in a community, that was exciting intellectually. That was if there was a picture, it was, I wanted to be in a community that was intellectually stimulating and exciting. And so I did things that, fit that plan. And if I couldn't be part of that, then I just left. I just went somewhere else. And quite often nowhere, just waiting for another opportunity to emerge. And luckily for me, opportunities kept emerging. I consider myself extremely lucky in that regard, most of it, all of the time, pretty much something good happened, even though I wasn't like planning it out step by step.
I had a question about, you mentioned it. I had a question about collaboration, basically, because I think I mentioned in the first episode, there's a profile on you in PNS that came out a few years ago or something. And at the end, there's a quote of you, which is, I'm not somebody who wants to do it all on my own. And the most fun and most productive times I've had have been in really deep collaborations. This to me seems to fit quite well with what you said, that you always wanted to be part of a group of exciting people who did cool stuff. I'm curious, maybe as a first question here, what makes a good collaborator, or how can people become better collaborators from your experience?
Wow.
Or maybe what did you like about collaborators?
I mean, the collaborations that worked for me, and I think this is what one ought to look for, are, people who you respect and trust, and people who have expertise and knowledge base that you don't have. So that, between the two of you, the sum of the parts is way more than just adding the two together, because you can spark each other in ways that are very productive. But it depends upon, picking the right person, because it's got to be someone who you can work with, who can tolerate, your style of working, but who you completely trust, that when they say something about an area you don't know about, you trust that they know what they're talking about, and you just take it on face value. Of course, it's sometimes hard to know who those people are, so that takes a while. Yeah, but I think nowadays, in this era of big science, where nobody can do anything, with all the new techniques and technologies involved, one is forced to do that, basically. Here at the Kavli, I've been actually interviewing the Mosers about this kind of stuff. And the same point comes out, basically, that you can't do it you can't do it all yourself. You have to have collaborators who you trust, basically. So, but how to sort of identify those people is tricky. In the case of O'Keefe, it was somebody that I knew from graduate school. I knew I could trust him completely. And he, I think, had the same level of trust in me. And with my other major collaboration with Moscovich, I knew him from when I was a graduate student also. He was an undergraduate with McGill. So these were people who I already had a strong relationship with, that I knew I could trust as people and as scientists. And so that was the foundation. And then we could just, basically exchange ideas and thoughts and trust each other, that we knew what we were talking about. And that, made it possible to accomplish a lot more as a team than either of us could ever have accomplished. And that's why I prefer, the collaborative mode. And I think, it was interesting, this point came up in my interview with Edvard Moser. He said the fact that there were two of them, that he and my Brit were that was actually a big advantage. They could try ideas out on each other, basically, in a way that, if one of them was isolated by themselves, they might not have been able to do it. So, having this kind of sounding board of somebody you completely trust, going back and forth, it really worked well for me. And I think it's in general, a good way to do it. There are some people who can't do that. Some people who really want to be the only show in town. So I mean, that's not me, never has been. And I'm happy to have had my career the other way, as collaboration.
Yeah. And I was also curious here from the kind of, not exactly flip side, but as a head of department, is there anything head of departments can do for this? Or is it kind of, I don't know, is it just hiring the right people who seem like other people would trust and who know stuff?
Yeah. I think that's the key there. And you don't know what's going to happen. You certainly end up collaborating most extensively, typically with people who you bump into in the hallway. So one thing that I always looked for in hiring was people who would not show up, close their door, have their own little group, but not interact with others. They might be highly successful, but they were not open to other influences and so on. So I tried to avoid hiring people like that and try to, people who I already knew based on talking to other people or, my knowledge of them and et cetera, that these are people who are going to come and are going to interact with other people. They're going to share with other people. They're going to, draw other people in and so on. So, people vary in that regard. Some people just want to do their own thing. Basically, they want to be left alone with their group, small or large, and do their own thing. And there are others who, say, I'm open to collaborating with, and those are the kinds of people we tended to hire in Arizona. People who were more likely to be collaborative. Again, you can't be perfect in figuring out who those people are unless you have evidence and, specific evidence. But we were pretty successful in hiring people who were that kind of, so that we created an extremely collaborative environment at Arizona, basically, and also one that was very nurturing of students, because I think those things tend to go together. I mean, at some level, although not always, but they do tend to go together. So we created what I thought was a really good environment for 15 or 20 years. I mean, I think it still is, but I can't say with any certainty. But what I do know is that, students who were there in the early 90s through the 90s, early aughts, they frequently comment about, what a special environment it was. Now, a lot of people say that about their graduate school environment. It's just, it's kind of part of the deal. But really they say, I didn't understand when I was there just how unusual the environment was, and now that I'm somewhere else and I see that people don't always keep their doors open and talk to everybody. People don't always nurture and encourage in the same way that was just taken for granted at Arizona. So that was, I think that's been part of the goal. I'm proud of that, achievement, basically I mean, the rewards you get as a department head are different than the rewards you get as a researcher. I mean, you don't get publications, you get the pleasure of knowing that you've advanced other people's careers, that you've actually, made better science, not just by yourself, but by the people around you. So I think, I feel like we did that in those years. It was maybe easier to do it back in that time because the pressures weren't quite the same as they are now. Higher education, even research institutions have changed a lot. But in those days, you could do that and get away with it, and we did.
Yeah. I'm curious, what are some, in a sense, I'm trying to get at what it's like to be a head of department and run that kind of thing, because obviously most people don't have that kind of experience. I'm trying to ask it in a slightly more intelligent way than just what was it like. So maybe as a, maybe how, is it all just admin? Can you still do research if you're head of department?
Oh, absolutely. No. I mean, you do less. I didn't think it would affect me as much as it did. But when I look at my CV during the years when I was head of department, I was clearly less productive. So it eats into that. But if you have a good lab and you have a few people like a postdoc or two who are really good, if you have a functioning lab, you don't have to be 100% in the lab. You can actually devote some time to these other things. And so, it is certainly possible to be a department head and to have an active research career. It won't be quite as active maybe, but it by no means cuts off that, that avenue. It was, as I say, it was good to feel that I was nurturing other people's careers, especially the young people that we hired. It was that was a lot of positive things going on there. Yeah, there was a lot of negative crap about being a department head, time wasted in committees and doing administrative nonsense. I tried to limit that as much as possible. I would say I was the kind of department head who skated pretty close to the edge of the line, in terms of what you can do and not do when you're an administrator. The rules were always there to be bent a little bit. And, and I think it also, is important if you're going to be a department head to be somebody who has, let's say, good social skills, in interacting with people. I mean, if you want to do good things for your department, you have to be able to get along with the dean. You have to be able to get along with the provost. You have to be someone who, can put forward a positive kind of affect in all of these situations. That was the part that people might not have predicted. And that was the part that I turned out to be pretty good at, that I myself wouldn't have predicted. Turns out, I can be convincing when I want to be, sort of, and so, in that circumstance, it was a rewarding role, but it's not for everybody. There are certain kinds of people who will not do well, as department heads. Turned out I think I did fairly well.
Why did you take it then, if it was also a bit of a surprise to you that you were good at it?
Yeah. I took it. It was challenging, and I like a challenge, but I took it because it gave me the opportunity to directly influence the growth of the program. When I took it in 1989, we were just really beginning to build. We had made some critical hires, but Bruce McNaught and Carol Barnes, that all happened under my watch. I did all of the work behind getting that to happen, and a number of other people. I took it because I figured I could actually shape, the course of the way this emerging kind of enterprise, which started almost nowhere, and became this, very strong department, that I could have a strong influence on that. I could create the community that I wanted to be a part of. I could help create it. And I couldn't do that if I wasn't department head. I could influence things, but Arizona had a strong department head arrangement where the department head really had a lot of power. I was not elected. It's not like a rotating position where somebody does it for 3 years and the next person does it for 3 years. I did it for 13 years. And I had a lot of power. I wasn't after the power. I was after what the power gave me, the ability to really shape the environment, that I and the others were going to be living in, and, managed to do that. So that's why I took it, because of the opportunity, the challenge to do that, and the possibility of creating a strong community.
It sounds like a very good decision for you and the place. I mean, you seem to enjoy it, and
I did. I enjoyed it. I think it was good. I don't know what impact it had on my family life. I was busier than, I might otherwise have been. By that point in time, I had 5 kids, so 3 of them were still living at home. They were young kids. I was department head with like a 3-year-old, you know what I mean? So I had, and I was a single father for some portion of that time. So I had a lot on my plate, basically, but, somehow you just do, you do what you have to do, and it kind of worked out. So you'd have to ask my kids, who probably thought I did nothing but work most of the time, but they all seem relatively well adjusted, and they still talk to me. So I have to assume it wasn't tragically horrible for them.
Well, that's nice. Yeah, but I'm curious, like, how you then managed to handle all these things. I mean, you said you kind of just do what you have to do. Is that just it? And I guess you
don't sleep a lot.
Yeah, I mean, you also seem to have a fairly relaxed attitude, as far as I can judge from a distance.
Yes. It turned out that I was very good at not agonizing over decisions, and not agonizing over things that went wrong, and not taking it home at night and being all stressed out in the evening when I went home. I was pretty good at just letting stuff roll off my back, basically, and just moving, forward. Basically, again, I'm not sure I would have predicted it, but it turned out. And I think that's a very important attribute for a department head. If you end up agonizing about stuff and letting everything eat away at you, you'll be within a few years, you'll burn out. So I never really burned out, basically, except for dealing with the staff. So it turned out that, the worst part of being a department head is dealing with the non-academic staff who, in the front office and, the people, doing that kind of work. We had a fairly big front office at that time, because this goes back to the days when, the people in the front office, would type up professors' exams for them, for example. There were no computers yet, right? I mean, so that we had a pretty big staff, and I had to manage that staff, and that turned out to be really problematic. I wasn't so great at managing, people who I thought were being petty and, having silly jealousies, and this person has a bigger desk than I have, and this person's office has a window but mine doesn't, and all of that kind of nonsense, basically. That finally ate away at me, and kind of that was a strong reason why I finally gave it up. I just couldn't deal with that stuff anymore.
But scientists aren't petty at times?
Well, yes, I was about to say, of course, some of the same things were true of the faculty, but you can't tell them that. You can't say you're acting like a spoiled teenager. You have to find a way of getting them to, understand the right thing to do, so to speak, and you have a certain amount of angst. But I would say that person for person, pound for pound, I had way more trouble with the staff than I did with the faculty. Again, it's a matter of choosing your right faculty colleagues, some of which I couldn't choose, but many of which I could. So we didn't have a lot of problems. We had a very, very collegial environment, but there were some individual faculty who were, I thought in the end quite silly, in one way or another. And I did my best to try to navigate around it, but I didn't obsess about any of it. I went home, turned on the music, cooked a meal, enjoyed my kids, and I enjoyed my new wife, who I got together with in '89, and we're still together now. So this was a relationship that really was the one I was waiting for in my life, and so all of that worked out okay. But it was it had its difficult moments, obviously, but it worked out, and a lot of it was because I just don't obsess about stuff. That's a characteristic of my personality, and it served me well in this regard.
Yeah. Not caring can be a great help.
Well, of course, there's risks in not caring, and especially at the personal level. Right? It's a fine there's a fine line between being able to deal with things without obsessing about them and just ignoring problems that you need to deal with. I mean, I didn't always find the right position on that continuum. But, in the long run, it served me well to be the sort of a person who didn't let things eat away at me. I just sort of did what I had to do in the moment, the best I could do, and that was the best I could do. And then just move on.
It's a good attitude. I think I need more of that. I tend to think, I think things through more than necessary.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's because I don't think stuff through that much.
Well, I'm not sure it helps. So I think you're doing well there. Agonizing about it before it happens, I'm not sure it's really adaptive.
No, well, all of that is. I got a fortune cookie in a Chinese restaurant, which said something like, anxiety about the future is like a down payment on something that may never happen. So that kind of, thinking through all the scenarios and all the bad things that might happen, obviously you have to do some cost benefit analysis about your behavior at some level, but agonizing about it endlessly is, to me, very counterproductive. And I have tried to avoid doing that, in most of my life, and sometimes to my detriment, but, that's been a strategy.
I wanted to ask a little bit about the hippocampal history. How did it start?
When I retired, I thought, I need something to do. So I know all these people. I was there at the dawn of the hippocampal era, you might say. I was, in Montreal with Brenda Milner. So even the people who preceded John and me in the panoply of hippocampal world, I knew all those people personally. So wouldn't it be an interesting project to, write a kind of a history of the early days of the hippocampus? That's what got it started. And so I sent out sort of a request to a bunch of people from my generation and asked them if they would want to contribute, their thoughts about some very specific questions. How'd you get started on the hippocampus? Things like that. And I got some responses, but I didn't get enough responses from it. And I got a half a dozen or more. And then the project kind of just lay fallow for a while. And then I picked it up again during COVID, thinking, the hell with writing a book. My initial thought was I was going to take all of this stuff and write a book. And the more I thought about it, the less I liked the idea of writing a book, because it was hard to think about writing it without it being sort of narcissistic. because I was involved in, I mean, these were all my friends, and some of the stories would be about, me I mean, it was just too much about me, and that's not what I wanted to do. So then I came up with this idea most recently of the hell with the book. I'll just take these interviews that I've done with other people, verbal or not. Most of them were written. Most people just wrote me their reminiscences, so to speak. And I'll just post them online, why not? And that's how the series in Mastodon got going. And now there are 13 such postings. But now I have a long interview with Brenda Milner that I need to cut down and figure out how to cut it up into parts that Mastodon can deal with. And I have just now completed interviews with Edvard and Maj-Britt Moser, which I will post online once I've cleaned them up. And that was today. So today is interview day. I'm interviewing them. You're interviewing me. It's kind of amusing. So that project was really initially a kind of a vanity project, which rapidly turned into something else, and not so rapidly. And I've gotten a lot of very positive feedback from the younger generation. People who really enjoy reading about like what it was like back then, kind of stuff. And I'll continue doing it, and I'm going to push on some more people to contribute to it, because I get a lot of. I mean, I started this on Mastodon. I suddenly had 400 followers. I mean, that's ridiculous, because I'm not engaged with social media, but a lot of people wanted to sort of hear about what it was like from the people who actually lived it. So that was it, and it still is. It's now evolving in that regard. I'm probably going to start asking some younger people from the next generation following mine, like the Mosers, who are kind of in their mid-50s, moving on to 60. That era of people who came of age in the hippocampal world after the book was out, after LTP had been discovered, who were really beginning their career in the late 80s, early 90s, like the Mosers and Mike Hasselmo and other people like that. So I've already got Hasselmo to give me his. So I'm going to reach out to more and more people. And it'll be a little bit less the people that I personally knew very well, but it'll be people who are important to the field, who have been important to the field, and whose reminiscences and observations, might be of some value to the next generation going forward. That's the idea behind it, and it's ongoing. It's kind of like what you're doing. I mean, but nowhere near as organized as what you're doing. You're doing it kind of like professionally well. I'm just doing
trying.
Yeah.
I mean, both have advantages and disadvantages, right? But I think the motivation is the same to kind of. I mean, I feel like you can. Most of the stuff you learn is not something you learn by reading a research paper or a textbook or whatever, right? Like a lot of the interesting things about how science actually is done and what things actually mean. People can just tell you in 5 minutes stuff you could never read in any paper.
Right. Exactly. So I want to go back to the research, because I'm going to have to quit in about 7 minutes. And if in the 90s, I focused a lot on hippocampal development, and my lab was really, really focused on the implications of late maturation of the hippocampus, and looking at rat pups and stressing rat pups and doing all kinds of research like that. It was pretty interesting and exciting. But then in the mid 1990s, Morris Moscovich came to Tucson for a sabbatical, and we got caught up in thinking about human amnesia, and the multiple trace theory resulted from that collaboration with Morris during that sabbatical. And that sort of altered the trajectory of my research going forward from there. And then I got much more engaged with the human research. We started doing neuroimaging, on remote memory, started thinking about issues about reconsolidation and all of those issues that, came out of thinking about the multiple trace theory. And that has really dominated, my research trajectory ever since, basically. And that was, again, just a kind of almost an accident. If Morris hadn't come to do a sabbatical there, that probably wouldn't have happened. But it was a collaboration. Again, it was two people who trusted each other, were willing to think about something a little bit out on the edge. And, the rest became history.
Yeah. One thing that kind of surprised me about some of your work is like how much of it was clinical, that you did a lot of like developmental disorders and that kind of stuff. Was that
That came out of I just literally today gave a talk on my developmental stuff here at the Institute, and talked about the clinical implications and all of that. That was because of a collaboration with a guy called Jake Jacobs, who I also met at Dalhousie, who trained in animal learning theory and then shifted gears to go into clinical work, but trying to apply, the science from learning and conditioning research to clinical things. He got caught up in the idea of multiple memory systems with different developmental trajectories. And that kind of led to a lot of the development work with Jake, with focusing on the implication of the fact that in the first few years of life, the learning that takes place is taking place in non-hippocampal systems because the hippocampus isn't functional yet for the first 2 years. So the memories that we acquire in the first few years of life are decontextualized because it's the hippocampus that attaches things to context. So these decontextualized memories are part of your backbone, basically, and they may reemerge later. If they're bad memories, you don't know where you got them from, but they affect your behavior, down the road. And that then was very suggestive of clinical syndromes like phobia and panic attacks. When the person said, when I do such and such, I panic. I have no idea why. I don't know what caused this, but this is what happened. And we began to see this pattern, that some things that happened early in life before the hippocampus could have an outsized effect on later behavior, and in particular could lead to certain anxiety disorders. And that sort of was the clinical route that the developmental stuff led to this thinking about clinical stuff, basically. And so that just burgeoned out, but largely because of this collaboration with Jake Jacobs, who deserves a lot of the credit for having taken that direction. My involvement with Down syndrome was a completely different angle. I just got called in to think about Down syndrome and what might be causing the mental retardation. And when I looked at what little literature existed in the mid-'80s, I said, wow, there's a hippocampal story here. This actually is directly relevant. And it turns out that improper development of the hippocampus is one of the signature features of Down syndrome in both humans and mouse models. And it helps to explain some of the aspects of the mental retardation. So I got caught up in different kinds of developmental issues for different reasons, but it all came out of, sort of this understanding about the implications of the late maturation of the hippocampus. Down syndrome case being that extra chromosome right from birth affects the development, in particular, of late developing structures. In Down syndrome, sort of development ends too soon. There's like premature closure of development, not just in the brain, but also in the heart, in the skin folds, in the eye folds. There's a bunch of ways in which that manifests itself, but it has particular impact on late developing systems. So hippocampus, prefrontal cortex, portions of the cerebellum. So we did a lot of work sort of pointing out how this played out in these late developing systems. And so that, it was another idea, but it emerged from, basic understanding of the implications of the postnatal maturation of the hippocampus.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, but you have to leave.
I do. Yeah, now unfortunately I have to leave. Well, look, if you think of another few questions, we can. I'm going back to Tucson next week. After I'm going to be in Berlin next week actually to give a talk there at the Charité, and then I'll spend a few days in Berlin, and then we're back to Tucson and back to normal life or something like that. So if you have other questions, who knows. But I hope this was useful. I hope this filled in some of the gaps.
I think it definitely was. Thank you very much.
All right, Ben. Good luck.